Good afternoon. It's Monday the 23rd of April 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Right, we're going to get straight on then with Yemen. Now, we haven't talked about Yemen in quite some time. A lot of the focus, Patrick, has been on Syria. But this is an image showing another Yemeni wedding bombed by Saudi Arabia UAE. Now I'm going to show just a little bit of video. It's quite disturbing, but a number of points here. First of all, this is a young boy being rescued from the rubble by the first responders, which are not wearing white helmets. The father, unfortunately, is dead, and the boy was absolutely refusing to leave his father's side. It staggered me, Patrick, how the approach of the people attempting to help here is so much different to that we see in Syria. But, you know, the key point is here that yet again we have an ongoing conflict which gets virtually no media coverage and certainly none of the criticism that people are receiving in the Syrian conflict.
The first thing is for people to realize you're looking at a real aftermath of a real bombing here. And like Mike just said, just contrast that with the sort of staged, contrived videos from the white helmets, which they've been pumping out for the last 5 years out of Syria. But it is amazing, Mike, that a tragedy like that doesn't warrant any international outrage, doesn't order any righteous indignation on the part of any of the Western politicians or the Guardian or any of the media outlets. So where's the concern? Does it mean that the Yemeni lives are not worth as much as the lives that are tied to some U.S. or British intervention?
Well, of course, there's no need, in the case of Yemen, there's no need for the mainstream media in this country to be promoting war because it's already happening, and it's already happening with the full support of the British government with arms sales and so on. But now we missed this at the time. This is about a week old, actually, this Guardian article. It's from Dr. Lina Khatib, who is head of Middle East and North Africa program at the Royal Institute for International Affairs, otherwise known as Chatham House. And the headline in The Guardian was, it was right to strike Syria, but only bringing Russia to the table can end the Syrian conflict. Well, it wasn't right to strike Syria, but I think we could agree that only bringing Russia to the table can end the Syrian conflict. But of course, Russia is already at the table. It's us that don't want to take part in the peace process that's going on. Isn't that is the case? Is a fair statement?
Yeah, well, you're trying to illustrate the situation, Mike, but what the problem here is, my question is, what is the agenda behind this? Is Chatham House speaking, right, ostensibly? So what is the Chatham House agenda here?
Well, what they're saying is, I'll just quote a little bit, it should not be forgotten that in the end, chemical weapons are not the main problem in Syria. They are the symptom of the real problem, which is the Assad regime in power. So the first point is that the Chatham House continues the get rid of Assad rhetoric. There can never be peace in Syria while the regime of Bashar al-Assad is in power, she says. Now that the US is committed to military action, attacks can only be a means to an end, the route to putting enough pressure on Russia to convince it to agree to serious negotiations. Serious negotiations mean declaring the Astana process and the Sochi talks dead and abandoning the facade that Russia became adept at exhibiting during the Geneva process. For Russia to behave seriously in negotiations, it has to believe that the US is serious. What works in favour of the US is that its key allies, the UK, France and Saudi Arabia, are all aligned. This gives it a unique opportunity to engage in a sustained, targeted campaign against Assad's military assets that has wide international endorsement. So in other words, we've got to keep bombing because that's worked to the degree that it's worked so far. The only way to get Russia to the table is to keep bombing because that shows that the US, Britain, France and Saudi Arabia are serious. Therefore, Russia will come to the table and get all this sorted out very, very quickly.
There's a few comments I'm just going to make to respond to this, Mike. The first is the author, Lina Khatib, is basically, as you said, Mike, parroting the assumption that the Assad regime used chemical weapons on April 6th in Duma. There is no proof of this. There is no evidence other than edited social media postings. That, my friends, is not evidence. Secondly, this talking point, Assad must go. How long have they been wringing this rag out, Mike? Since 2011.
It's almost as embarrassing as Russiagate, isn't it?
It's even longer than Russiagate. So who knows? Russiagate might outlast Assad must go. But and again, advocating military intervention as some sort of policy in order to bring the Russians to the negotiating table or force a political solution in Syria. I would contend that this author has not been to Syria recently. If she had, she would realize that President Assad is overwhelmingly popular. The Syrian government is overwhelmingly popular in Syria. I'm not talking about 50% popular. I'm talking about 60, 70+%. People are behind the government. They're behind their president, even more so because of the foreign backing to the so-called opposition. And my last point, Mike, is she's saying that they must declare the Astana process dead. I'll beg to differ, and I think anybody who's actually paid attention would declare the Geneva process dead. From the minute it started with Geneva 1, then to 2, then to 3, the Syrian National Council, a hand-picked group of Westerners that are somehow this kind of government in exile, that they were somehow going to assume power in Syria. It's a joke. The only people who believed it, I think, are people who read The Guardian and who watch the BBC. Astana has actually done some amazing things on the ground. The de-escalation process, the peace and reconciliation process, thousands of areas have been converted from hot zones to de-escalation to now completely, there's no combat, no fighting going on, and many militants have gone through the reconciliation process, which is guaranteed by Russia. And some have been relocated to the Idlib province, for instance, to sort of outsource the problem, get it out of the way so that life can get back to normal in Syria. That's the reality of the Astana process. And unfortunately, the United States is not a stakeholder in that process. The effective process that's actually done real work on the ground, the US, Britain are not involved. So again, what I'll say, Mike, is the center of gravity geopolitically has shifted from west to east, from ostensibly from Geneva, Switzerland to Astana, Kazakhstan, or if you will, from the US to Russia and Iran. Turkey is also a partner in the Astana process as well. So once again, I can't believe, Mike, how Chatham House could get it this wrong, but looks like they have.
Well, you're talking about things shifting towards the east, and indeed they are. So let's look at a couple of examples. Russia-China summit going on today. This is Russia and China's aiming to have strict compliance with international agreements. They're saying very important role in boosting global stability. So this is Sergei Lavrov meeting with his Chinese counterpart Wang Li today. Russia and China's consolidated policy aimed at strictly complying with international law plays a key role in strengthening stability and security in the world, said Lavrov. We expect high intensity of contacts to be maintained this year as well. And he said that for his part, Wang Yi, said that for his part, further strengthening of Russia-Chinese relations is in the two countries' best interests. I hope that today's talks, which precede tomorrow's SCO Council of Foreign Ministers meeting, will make it possible for us to talk about all issues and outline plans for the future. So Russia and China getting ever closer, and we're starting to see the chessboard, the pieces moving into possibly their final positions, Patrick?
Indeed, and also I think there was an announcement this morning, which we haven't reported on the newsline today, but Iran announcing it will be moving off the US dollar in terms of international trade. So not that that wasn't expected, but still, nonetheless, that's just one more country going off the US dollar, the sort of the international fiat standard of the US dollar. So if this is a trend, we'll see, but I think it is in terms of Russia and China trade as well.
Now, very important because in Southeast Asia, of course, we've got Korea, and the peace process in Korea seems to be moving on apace. And this is Moon and Kim to meet an official dinner on Friday. Apparently, this summit is going to take place. So Moon Jae-in and the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, holding an official dinner on joint security during their historic summit. That's going to start on Friday. But Patrick, Trump is somehow going to be involved in this at some later date in the next few weeks, but possibly not going quite as smoothly as he would hope.
Well, the meeting with Donald Trump and North Korea and South Korean representatives at Roundtable Summit, end of May, beginning of June, and so it is very hyped, Mike, and for good reason, because I think, as we discussed yesterday on the Sunday Wire program, Donald Trump, this could be his legacy moment. This could be the one achievement that could be inked in the history books of something positive that Donald Trump, and definitive and tangible, that Donald Trump has done during possibly his one term, even his 2 terms as president. We'll see what happens in the next election. But so there's a lot of pressure by Trump, I think, to make this work. But at the same time, Mike, the hawks are circling Donald Trump. The vipers are well and truly in the nest in the form of John Bolton and others. And I think what they want out of this Korean summit, Mike, is probably very different, and they're not concerned with Trump's legacy. What they're concerned about is basically getting leverage on China. And so if the United States brokers a peace deal or a treaty between the U.S., between North and South Korea, this could mean, Mike, the end of the DMZ, the demilitarized zone there, and with that, a 70-year presence in Asia. And really, if you look at the U.S. military presence in Okinawa, and even it's trying to get more advantage in the Philippines as well, and some of the other areas. This is all based, really, they justify it on the basis of North Korea. So that, although it's really about China, but the U.S. doesn't want to come out and say that it's geopolitically trying to encircle China, when in fact that looks like what they've been doing for the last 2 decades. But so that's why this Korean summit is really important. How is it going to play out? Which direction is it going to go? Is it going to stall and turn into another Oslo situation that could string out over 10 plus years? And really, during that time, the U.S. will just be regrouping and increasing its military presence and putting more geopolitical silent pressure on China. These are the things to look for going into this summit at the end of May or beginning of June. Okay,
so but just before we move away from international affairs, the G7 is taking place in North America at the moment. Boris Johnson, as you can see, is over there, and they're talking about the malign activities of Vladimir Putin. They're talking about how terrible it is with nerve agents flying around the world and in Syria and in the UK. There's unity, they say, on opposing Russia's malign behavior. Well, Macron was there, of course. We were talking about Macron on the Sunday Wire last night as well. He says that the biggest priority for the G7 should be the spreading of fake news. They've got to deal with that. He said, don't be naive. Putin is obsessed by interference in our democracies. That's why I do believe that we should never be weak with President Putin. When you're weak, he uses it. So that's what Macron was saying. But there's the a happy couple there, Ms. Mogherini and Boris Johnson. Well, Boris Johnson also met up with Acting Secretary of State, John Sullivan. And I just thought Boris tweeted this picture out earlier on, Patrick.
Not very flattering, is it?
I thought it was hilarious. I mean, John Sullivan's, I've captioned this, "Who let this buffoon into the room?" I'll leave it to the audience to decide which one of them is the bigger buffoon, but clearly John Sullivan is looking a bit distressed, depressed.
Why would Boris tweet that picture out unless he's just trying to get as many selfies and pictures in before he himself is out on the carpet? We'll see.
We shall see. Right, let's come back to the UK then. Now, the Sunday Times pushed this out yesterday. Police in MI5 to get greater powers to fight terror. And they say that they've seen some documentation which says that there's going to be a focus on communities where the threat from terrorism and radicalization is highest. police services and domestic intelligence agencies, that's MI5, GCHQ, will be focusing on individuals who are vulnerable to radicalization or who are or have been of interest to the police and the security and intelligence agencies due to their possible links to terrorist activities, but who are not currently the subject of any active investigations. So we're going to expand this spy network quite significantly. They're going to alert a greater number of agencies to individuals of potential concern, and they are going to call for a change of approach and so on. So, Patrick, who do you think they're going to be targeting in particular?
Well, it's the term extremist, Mike. It can be a fungible term. It's elastic. So I think that how wide is the berth on that term extremism? Can that be extended to dissenting opinions or challenging the government? That's based on some of the past statements by governments. David Cameron's UN speech comes to mind, Mike. I think my fears there are not that outlandish.
No, and in fact, the document says that, of course, Islamic State is of concern. It still represents the most significant threat. It says that there's a persistent threat from Al-Qaeda, but it also says that there's a serious threat of Northern Irish terrorist factions and a growing threat from right-wing extremists.
Right, the media right now is extending right-wing extremism into anything from conspiracy theory to anybody who's seeming to be sympathetic to the Assad government, Assadists or Assad apologists, or Putinist, or people sympathetic to the Russian position will be extended into that right-wing category. That's already happened. My question, Mike, is are the police and MI5 going to look into any members of the government or members of the security services who are involved in the arming, the financing, the handling of radical jihadists from Britain going into Syria and coming back, or to Libya in the past, as in the Manchester bombing? Is that on the table in terms of these investigations? Is that not a problem? We're talking about the top extremists. We're talking about the ones willing to go and pick up a weapon and go and fight and kill people in cold blood in places like Syria, in places like Libya. That, to me, Mike, would be of a high priority.
Yeah, coming back here fully trained.
I believe so, and I believe that should be where all the state should be putting all its resources, is finding out who these people are. In fact, maybe even looking in the mirror and shutting down any of these clandestine programs that have been operating over the last decade.
Right, now Novichok, Patrick, TruePublica has pushed this out today. The headline is Evidence Novichok Delivery System Patented in the US. Now we'll come on to Tim Hayward, of course, because he mentioned this in one of his articles a couple of weeks ago, but this adds a little bit to it. So what they're saying is that deliberately overlooked, or more likely ignored in the press, was that Russia had submitted evidence that the Novichok nerve agent was produced and patented in the United States as a chemical weapon in 2015. Russia's permanent representative to the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons had said 2 weeks ago. TruePublica say that they were not satisfied with Russia's story on the basis that they would, of course, defend themselves regardless of the truth. Mm-hmm. So unlike everyone else, well, mostly everyone else, because Tim Hayward and his group had already looked, but they looked. And they said half an hour later, they found over 80 patents of the 140 that Russia said were applied for. The ones we found revealed the word Novichok in 81 patents as part of the patent document filing in the United States. They say that this does not mean that all patents actually involved the nerve agent itself. But it does suggest that this deadly substance was at least available, particularly as none of these patents go back further than 2002. And some of them were applied for as recently as 2016. And one they found was granted as late as last November. And just to give one example, they have a patent filing that they give an example of, which is a powder dispersal device. And it was filed in May 2016. It includes, for example, without limitation, it says, Agent 15, which is BZ, ammonia, arsenic pentafluoride, boron tribromide, boron trichloride, hydrogen cyanide, nitrogen mustard, the 3 variants, and a Novichok agent. So these patents are using the word Novichok. And then they say in TruePublica, contrary to what we've been told about the deadly nature of Novichoks, there is a nerve agent antidote patent filed in 2013 that was granted in November 2017. Another is for methods of detection, and another for protection against the neurotoxin Novichok. So a whole host of patents. Now, of course, patents are patents. They don't mean that anything was actually developed following the patent filing.
Not necessarily, but
exactly, possibly,
possibly.
absolutely, possibly. But what it does do is demonstrate that the term Novichok and the type of nerve agent that we're talking about was front and center in people's minds, because otherwise these patents wouldn't have been filed. And we're looking at delivery systems being developed. Does this not hint at active weapon system development in the United States?
It seems to be there's a plethora of evidence here, Mike, that's pointing at the United States as the real source of the Novichok industry. And you are right, not just conveniently ignored, but I think intentionally ignored in this case.
Yes. So as we say, Tim Hayward published this a couple of weeks ago, update the briefing note, doubts about Novichoks.
So this is something that's up on Tim Hayward's blog, which everybody can go and reference, but this is based on the work of the Syrian Working Group on Syria, Media and Propaganda, of which Professor Piers Robinson is a member there, and who's been on this show just recently. And so what it's saying here is that this idea of what the Novichok is the sort of the class of nerve agents, the A23 to A260 range, and so it's saying that this has actually been developed by the United States, even at the U.S. Army's Biological and Chemical Weapons Research Center at Edgewood, Maryland, the Aberdeen Proving Ground at Edgewood, Maryland. So, and this was recorded in 1998. And it was also listed by NIST on the database of compounds, but then suddenly, Mike, deleted off of the NIST list. We do have a screen. We had a screenshot of that, but you can go to Tim's blog and look at that. But so this is a real U.S. lab, a real U.S. military weapons lab who's developed this high-grade nerve agent. Absolutely developed it, and so then we have a number of patents, Mike. It seems to me like that's where, if you want to investigate of who's working on Novichoks, I think the United States is the place to go.
Right, let's move on to the media, Patrick. And, well, I have to say, you nearly fell off your chair this morning when you saw this.
Well, you know, you can't make it up, really, can you? This is a Pulitzer Prize 2018, and here we go. Who won? The New York Times and the Washington Post, get ready for it, folks, have won a Pulitzer Prize for their relentless reporting and coverage about Russian interference in the 2016 presidential elections.
Sorry, can I just understand what's going on here? Two newspapers have won the Pulitzer Prize on the basis of coverage of something which didn't happen? Which
didn't happen, which they haven't found any evidence of yet, and the connections with the Trump campaign. So even on top of that, Russian collusion. So this, if anything, this should signify that the Pulitzer Prize is, like the Nobel Peace Prize, is well and truly a farce. But for journalism, Mike, the Pulitzer is meant to be the sort of the gold standard in terms of journalism. And for them to give that award to those two papers that have been relentlessly pumping out fake news for the last 18 months on Russian interference and Trump-Russian collusion, and they both got a Pulitzer for it. So what's the moral of the story there, Mike? What message are they sending to aspiring journalists?
Fake news is good.
Fake news is good for your career. If you want to advance in the mainstream world, you got to be doing fake news. So clear as day.
Well, of course, particularly for the BBC, if you want to be pushing out fake news, you've got to be vetted first. And this came out yesterday. I think the vetting files, how the BBC kept out, quote, subversives. Yes. This article seems to claim that this stopped in the mid-1990s. Do you believe that?
So it's extraordinary. So according to Paul Reynolds, one of the first journalists to have a look at this file, Mike, the broadcaster, the BBC, adopted a policy of keep your head down and stonewall all questions. So for how many decades? 5, 6 decades here. And so the quote here, this is from the Director General, Sir Hugh Green, at the time. So we have 23,000 staff in that community. We have people of all descriptions, including what you call pansies. The word had apparently been used by the reporter, and also communists, said Green. And there was a fear, Reynolds wrote, that evilly disposed engineers might sabotage the network at a critical time. This was in the run-up, I guess, or World War II. Or that conspirators might discredit the BBC so that the way could be made clear for a left-wing government at the time. So my question is, based on that quote, Mike, has anything changed, even politically? Are we seeing the exact same thing? Is history not repeating itself in this instance?
Well,
and if you did have that policy of vetting BBC employees to make sure they are of the right political mind and also controlling speech, with MI5 doing the job of that, once you have achieved that power, Mike, why would you relinquish it at any point?
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe both institutions had an epiphany in the 90s and saying, well, this isn't right, we shouldn't do this anymore, it's just not right, so let's just quietly stop the practice?
Yes.
Or like the CIA, from the Church Commission in the mid-70s, we learned about the CIA's activities in all the major media outlets and editorial desks in the US mainstream media, and we're meant to believe that all of that stopped and ceased to take place after the Church Commission hearings.
Yeah, because I mean, you put millions, if not billions, of dollars of investment into setting up this infrastructure, and then you just throw it away, don't you? It's the sort of thing you do.
Yeah, you're building up a network to basically control press, to control public perception on a whole range of issues. Why would you just withdraw? So I don't believe they did, not in the U.S., and I don't believe in Britain or any other country that has a similar system. It's just not.
Okay, well let's look at this this example of fake news. Then here's the Telegraph, and the headline is UN security team shot at in Syria ahead of chemical weapons inspection. Now, of course, that headline itself is not incorrect. There was gunfire whenever the UN security team attempted to go to Douma ahead of the OPCW visit, and that was one of the reasons why the OPCW visit was delayed. It was nothing to do with Russia holding them back and not letting them to Douma. It was because it was a security risk. But what I'm interested here actually is the photograph of the young lad and the caption, because here's the caption. It says, Khaled Mahmoud Nuzair, 25, who lost his wife and daughters during the alleged chemical weapons attack. Who lost his wife and daughters during the alleged chemical weapons attack. That's quite an unfortunate caption. They haven't changed it since the video clip came out. But let's just have a look at the interview that he gave to RT quickly.
People poured water over our heads, repeating that we had been attacked with chemical weapons. Somebody ran up from outside shouting about a chemical attack. We don't know who that was.
So Patrick, do you think that looks and sounds like somebody who's just lost his wife and daughter?
No, and
No,
it doesn't at all.
No, and in fact, they couldn't possibly have lost them unless they got mislaid somewhere, because there was no chemical weapons attack according to him. So what's the Telegraph doing here, Patrick?
I don't know. What is the Telegraph doing?
Well, I think it can only be doing one thing, and that is being purveyors of fake news. There can be no other explanation for this. It looks like a direct lie to me.
Alert, alert, fake news. Please report to Theresa May's crack task force on fake news. The Telegraph is guilty of fake news.
So I'd like to say thank you to the person who sent that to me earlier on. I'd also like to say thank you to the person who sent this to me, because this is the official emergency procedure. If you see any friend or colleague beginning to swallow mainstream media BS, and it's basically the Heimlich maneuver, and as you can see, they throw up the logos of the various mainstream media there. This is the point that we're at, where people are increasingly just taking the pee out of the mainstream press.
I want to say thank you to any UK column or also 21st Century Wire readers, listeners, and viewers for sending in or giving us tips on mainstream fake news, where there's actually false reporting or fabricated claims in the mainstream. We thank you very much. Who knows, one day, Mike, I don't know, they could have a hot tip line for mainstream fake news, maybe even pay for tips.
Well, and maybe those tips will appear on Media on Trial at some future event, but the next event is in Leeds on the 27th of May. Details at mediaontrial.uk. Get along to that if you possibly can. It really is more necessary than ever now. What's next? Get rid of it. In the Express, get rid of it. Massive 96% of Express readers want House of Lords abolished. Now I saw this being pushed around by an alternative media source today, Patrick, and I have to say it made me a little bit cross that they were, because they're missing the point completely. So what's this all about? Well, basically there was a defeat of part of the Brexit legislation last week in the House of Lords, and of course the fool of the day, Nigel Farage, was the first to be getting on a soapbox to say we've got to throw away the House of Lords as a result. Now, there's lots of criticism about the House of Lords because it's an unelected body, but the point is that we have ended up in a situation where part of our parliament has been sort of half changed. It's been changed to the point where it's basically dysfunctional at the moment, but this was a deliberate act to change it in that way. And why was it a deliberate act to change it in that way? Because the House of Lords, the role of the House of Lords is to hold the House of Commons to account constitutionally and make sure that the government of the day doesn't run riot with the constitutional settlement that we have. So who has been driving this modern process of House of Lords reform? Well, it really began with this man, Tony Blair. And are we really saying now that we want to promote the idea of his political agenda? We want to promote that? I don't think we really do. But in 1997, after the general election, Tony Blair and the Labour government announced a bill to remove the automatic right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the House of Lords as the first stage of a process of reform. In 1999, the House of Lords Act received royal assent and they threw out 600 hereditary peers. They left 92 there until further reform. Then Tony Blair in 2003 published a consultation on the removal of the law lords to be replaced by an EU-style Supreme Court. And in 2007, the government published its white paper, the House of Lords Reform, setting out policy for a hybrid House of Lords with 50% elected members, 50% appointed members. And in March of that year, the House of Commons voted on the options for composition supporting an elected House of Lords. So this is something that the Labour government under Tony Blair was pushing for extremely hard. The agenda was continued under the Chuckle brothers there, and that's David Cameron and Nick Clegg in the coalition government. In 2012, the Joint Committee on the draft House of Lords Reform Bill published a report recommending an electoral mandate and that 80% of members should be elected and 20% nominated. And in September that year, Nick Clegg made a statement announcing the withdrawal of the House of Lords Reform Bill, and basically because they couldn't get the support that they needed for it. Now this process has continued under Theresa May, and she also has not managed to get support for it to date. But nonetheless, the Brexit issue once again seems to be being used to drive this situation forward. Now, because Theresa May hadn't managed to get her reform agenda through, there were headlines like this appearing in the Telegraph. Theresa May risks making House of Lords a laughingstock over peerages. And the BBC asking, why is Theresa May dropping House of Lords reforms? My point here is, Patrick, that this is a government agenda that's been going on for 20 years now. It's a mainstream media agenda because they have absolutely been behind this from the beginning. And why? Because the House of Lords is defeating the government regularly on some of the most outrageous legislation that they try to push through. And so I'm going to say that if people don't understand that there is a massive risk in throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, then we're in trouble.
Not only that, but when you're obsessed with the symptoms and you're not looking at the core of the problem, the 1997 House of Lords reform movement by Tony Blair was not about reform, Mike. It's about undermining this branch of government, which is meant to be apolitical. That is the point behind hereditary peerages, whatever you agree or disagree, but you can't compare it to the United States Senate, for instance, because the U.S. Constitution is not the same as the British Constitution. These are two different government systems. And the problem is, because Tony Blair took a wrecking ball to the House of Lords, right after that, a raft of bills came, like, I don't know how many laws they passed from 1997. It was like one every 12 hours, I think, continuously for 10 years. So from a constitutional point of view, Mike, I would make the argument that all of those laws passed should really be null and void because they are unconstitutional. The system of government has been altered without the consent of the people, I would say broadly. But so now to use this Brexit issue as a call to get rid of the House of Lords is really, you're springing your own trap politically. I think it's extremely short-sighted, and I think that sort of taking that tact means that you're not looking deeply into this issue, and you're really dealing with the surface circus which is going on above. And it's a bit rich for Nigel Farage, who wears a Union Jack all the time, Mike, and is a great British patriot, to be undermining the very institutions that are the essential fabric of the country. I think it's extraordinary.
Absolutely, and of course, what are they arguing for? An elected second upper chamber, which is going to have the same political parties represented. And remember, we're not talking about people going into the House of Lords as representatives of their communities. We're talking about people going into an elected House of Lords as representatives of their political parties.
And
Whipped,
not just whipped by their political parties, Mike, whipped by the lobbies and the corporations whose interests they will be representing. Because what happened after Tony Blair's undermining of the House of Lords paid for peerages, Mike. Corruption, nonstop corruption in terms of paid for peerages, pay for access, just made a mockery of the government, of that branch of government especially, trying to politicize it in the toxic way that the House of Commons might be on a party basis, trying to basically pollute and contaminate the House of Lords with the same sort of political corruption. And so is it an improvement? Is it better than it was before 1997, Mike?
No.
There's your answer.
Yeah. Right, just a couple of short articles to finish with. First of all, Capita. This is widely reported across the mainstream media. Capita, massive services company, similar to Carillion, and it looks like in a similar financial state to Carillion, as we predicted at the time of the Carillion collapse. So they have announced a £515 million loss for 2017. Now, the reason that they say that they have made this loss, Patrick, and this is the important thing, really, is that they made something in the region of an £800 million write-down, accounting write-down, on the basis that in the past, from an accounting standpoint, they were allowed to account for profits on contracts which had not been fulfilled. In other words, they could put on their balance sheet a profit on a contract that they hadn't completed yet, so they didn't actually know what the contract was, what the profit actually was at the end of the day. They didn't know how much money they'd spent on the contract when the contract was completed, so they didn't know what the actual profit was. But because in the contract it said that they were probably going to make this amount of profit, they would put that on their books. So they've made an £800 million write-down because that accounting practice is no longer permitted.
Who signed off on that? Arthur Anderson?
I couldn't possibly comment. But
That's
anyway,
unbelievable.
A £500 million loss for 2017. So they're now going back to their shareholders and asking for a £700 million bung from their shareholders to keep them going.
Is this the same Capita that operates the C charge, Mike? The congestion charge?
That is the same Capita, yes.
In London. So they've been creaming money off of drivers for the last how many years? 15 years? With the cover charge to the biggest nightclub in the world, which is called London.
Yes.
And I don't know, have the cameras not been working? Have they not been collecting their money? Talk about printing money out of thin air. This is what Capita has been doing at the public expense for years, Mike. And now they're claiming that they're in the red. I don't understand.
Well, biting off more than they can chew, I think. Of course, Capita also famous for collecting the TV license and raising the money for the BBC. So
wonderful company.
Absolutely
wonderful company.
Yes. Yes. Anyway, and we're going to end with jobs now. Of course, the United States, world renowned for its manipulation of the jobs figures. Patrick.
Yes. There's two figures that no politician ever wants to own, Mike, and that is inflation and unemployment. These are the two things that you need to fudge. You need to fudge down both of those figures in order to have a good political career and legacy.
Absolutely. But in this country, it's 0 hours contracts, which are the main news. Well, let's see what's going on here. The Office for National Statistics, saying that the new business survey data for November 2017 shows 1.8 million contracts not guaranteeing minimum hours where work is done. And that's 6% of all contracts. It shows that 901,000 people are on 0 hours contracts between October and December 2017. That's 2.8% of all people in employment. But what's interesting, although that 901,000 people on 0 hours contracts, that figure they're going to maintain monitoring, but they intend to discontinue the business survey estimates on the number of contracts not guaranteeing minimum hours, which is the bigger figure. Of course, this helps the government pretend that we've got a fantastic jobs market in the UK, despite the collapsing incomes, the collapsing productivity, and the collapsing standard of the jobs. And Pat, I still cannot get to grips with the fact that the mainstream media continues to accept the jobs news from the British government without questioning the types of jobs that are being created, and the fact that the standard, the productivity and the quality of the jobs is collapsing around our ears. It doesn't matter, apparently, that we don't have any high quality engineering jobs anymore. It's shelf stacking and coffee serving. As long as you've got a job, that's all that's important.
Did you see that last week? They said growth going into a growth phase right now, Mike. Did you see that? It was all over the headlines last week after the bombing of Syria. That was the sort of feel-good news.
Well, let me show you just to close a growth. There is the growth in 0 hours contracts since 2011.
Well, that's something to celebrate. Some growth going on there.
Absolutely. So anybody wants to know why the unemployment statistics are so low, because these people are, they're more or less unemployed if they're on a 0 hours. Some of them are getting some decent work out of 0 hours contracts. Quite a lot of people aren't and are requiring multiple jobs in order to make a living because they're not getting any kind of guaranteed living. So the growth in 0 hours contracts is pretty impressive.
Well, we know that some people from the government do watch this show from time to time, so we'll give them a little advice. The next thing you should do is 1 hour contracts. At least start with, go from 0 to one guaranteed hour. If the government, Theresa May, can roll this out, I think it would have a really good, public would really like it. 1 hour, 1 hour contracts. So
okay, go for that.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you very much for joining me, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time, 1 p.m. as usual, tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye.